Hello and welcome. His album Calypso became the first in music history to sell 1 million copies, and he went on to become one of the most respected performers around. But through all of his success, he never forgot those in need, and has always been a very diligent humanitarian. This week on One, meet singer, actor and activist Harry Belafonte. From an early age, he was a natural performer and made his mark with his unique voice. But it was when he turned 20 that the young Harry Belafonte made the move into acting, becoming one of the leading faces in the entertainment industry. Born in Harlem, New York, with Caribbean roots, Belafonte was a rising star at a time when the rights of black people were still very much suppressed, which planted the seed of activism in him early on and brought him close to the legendary U.S. civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. Belafonte was taken seriously as he championed human rights. It was hard to ignore the man who produced the first million-selling record album, Calypso, in 1956. But his outspoken views also got him blacklisted. That didn't stop him introducing American audiences to African stars such as Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba. Age hasn't slowed the charismatic performer, who still continues to serve as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and a voice for what is right.
Well, Harry Belafonte, I'm very honoured to have a chance to speak with you.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you, sir. Now, you're one of the most successful singers in history, in the history of the music industry, known as the King of Calypso, for bringing that Caribbean music style to the international audiences back in the 1950s. At that time, how was it received?
Received very well. As a matter of fact, it was quite a chancy thing to do. When I went to RCA, I'd done some albums, but I found that the inner voice, that which I was most familiar with, was missing in my repertoire. And I tried to talk the company into letting me go awry and bring music from other cultures. And they somewhat resisted that. And fortunately, my relationship with the head of the company, George Marek, subsequently helped me find authority. So I went out and did this album called Calypso. And even the hierarchy said, we have no niche for this. We have no experience. Who's going to want it? And they kind of left it on the shelf until a group called the Tarriers, Alan Arkin was one of the members, came up with a song called Hill and Gully Rider, which was the root song for the song that I sang, which was the Banana Boat. And just as they released their album and it started to look promising, RCA got panicky and released our album, and it did quite well globally. Matter of fact, it became the first album in the history of the record business to sell 1 million copies.
Amazing.
So I assume that that is statement enough that the world had an appetite for it. And it's done very well since. But beyond the success of the music itself is that it did a lot to stimulate people's curiosity. A lot of people started to go to the Caribbean, look at these islands that they had heard sung about. The only time they had really known about such islands were all the stories on Hawaii. There was no other place so dreamlike until they discovered Jamaica and Cuba and Barbados and Puerto Rico and every place.
Some of the things you do raise a lot of eyebrows, being, friendly with Fidel Castro, giving Cuba some time and space. You also supported the Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez, on his plan to try to promote, a better sort of existence and life for his people and so on. Have you ever worried about a backlash against you in the US for going to these no-go areas as people in America are conditioned to think of them?
Dr. King was branded a communist, which he was not. And Nelson Mandela was considered one of the world's great terrorists. So there are always going to be these forces to do this. And my relationship with Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez has very little to do with the men themselves, as it has to do with the fact that I have a relationship with the world. I'm a citizen of the world. I had many friends in Cuba, musicians and artists, long before Fidel Castro became the president. And I have a lot of friends in Venezuela. And when Hugo Chavez promised all those resources to the black people who were the victims of Katrina, I had huge interest in what his offer would be. And when our president so distastefully rejected him and so rudely, without any statesmanship, my curiosity was piqued.
Tell me about your early years in Harlem, where you were born and you lived until you were about 8 years old. That was going in from the 20s, late 20s into the 30s. What was that time like?
It was a curious time, and it was a time of great problems. I was born in poverty. It was during the period of the Great Depression. My mother was an immigrant woman who had children much too young. She was a teenager when she started to bring us into the world. But interestingly enough, she never permitted the drudgery of being poor and the domestic and undersubscribed. She never permitted that to distract her from the responsibilities she had to her children. She was a woman of great cunning, deeply instinctual, and she had values that she imparted to her children. And that was enough for us to be able to find purpose in life. Harlem was tough. As a matter of fact, she sent us back to the Caribbean because she found life so difficult. And in the Caribbean, she felt we were more protected being raised by a village than we would be standing alone in New York while she went off to work to the wilds of the city.
That was the village of Aboukir in Jamaica, where you went to live with your grandmother for a while.
Abuka.
Yeah, Abuka, sorry. Yeah. Now, how was that time, the contrast? I mean, you were old enough, I guess, to sense the difference.
Oh, the difference was very finely drawn. I loved the environment. I loved the culture. I loved very much the things that people did, the dignity that I found in the farmers, in the music, in the culture. All the things that impacted me in a way that eventually became a great reservoir from which I drew for my own artistic interests, my culture, my songs, my value system for the kinds of films that I picked to do. It was a wonderful time for me.
Now, your father, Harold, after whom you were named, was in the British Navy. He was a chef, and he's originally from the East Caribbean island of Martinique. What was your relationship like with him?
I don't know that we had a relationship. He was an absentee father. He was quite the alcoholic, a man bent on great cruelty. He was a violent person. He constantly battered my mother. So the image of him in the midst of our growing up years was not a pleasant experience. I subsequently have found reason to see more in him than I had thought existed. But there was no reliance on him for anything that nurtured our lives. My mother stood the test alone.
You actually went back to New York pretty much as you were turning into your teens, but it wasn't long before you ended up serving in the Navy yourself.
Yes, I came back at the age of 12. I went at the age of 5, incidentally.
5
And I came back at the age of 12. And the world was at war. And when America got into the conflict, at the age of 17, first of all, I was a dropout from school, hitting the streets of New York, hanging out with gangs and things. But I sought to connect myself to something that I thought had purpose and mission. So I enlisted in the United States Navy to serve for 2 years. I found it a horrible experience. Didn't find it very democratic, and nothing about it was terribly heroic. It was a difficult time, but that period began to very sharply define my politics and my social attitude.
When you were in your early 20s, you started taking acting lessons, and you were alongside people like Marlon Brando, Tony Curtis, Walter Matthau, even Sidney Poitier. But what sort of relationship did you develop with these people?
It is very close, as a matter of fact. Many of us had the experience of serving in the Second World War, so we had some sense of commonality. And the idea of being in the theater is such an intense experience, and we had such great hopes for what we could do and achieve, that we developed a fundamental respect for one another, never suspecting that we would become whom we became. We thought everybody had just enough talent to do well. We could make a living. But for Marlon Brando to become so explosive, for Rod Steiger and Tony Curtis and B. Arthur and Tony Franciosa, Sidney Poitier, and certainly myself, who went on and I hadn't the foggiest idea. First of all, singing wasn't something I thought I'd do.
You actually paid for your acting classes by singing in a nightclub. And I think the first time you appeared on stage was with the Charlie Parker Band.
That's right.
Charlie Parker himself. And
Charlie Parker, Max Roach, Tommy Potter, Al Hay. My first backup band. That was the best thing in town. A
lot happened early in your life. You got married, I think, barely 21 to your first wife, Marguerite, and had 2 daughters very quickly, Adrienne and Sherry, I think.
Yes, very quickly.
How did you cope at such a young age with so much going on with the responsibility of fatherhood and so on?
Well, it wasn't easy, especially when you're trying to find your niche, coupled with the fact that I was building a career that had some promise. I was also running parallel with my political and social activism. I joined up with Eleanor Roosevelt and Paul Robeson and others, talking about the plight of the people in the world. And for that, a lot of people didn't like the relationships we had with the left-wing forces, with others who were very critical of America. And the House Un-American Activities Committee came after me. That's right. Exactly. And between them on one side and trying to maintain a career and a marriage that was somewhat strained, it was an extremely difficult period.
Harry Belafonte, I've got more questions for you. We're going to take a very short break here on 101. Back with Harry Belafonte in just a moment.